Koinonia is for community, and that's in our name, Nederland Community Presbyterian Church. As Koinonia, we care for each other, and we do our best to care for our neighbors. Who else are we? We are followers of Jesus on the way. We're disciples of a hodos. That's the Bible word for on the way, and that's the early word that the church called itself by, as the way. And their way was to act like Jesus with grace, with forgiveness, by having a challenging witness against the patterns of injustice in the world. They followed Jesus on a deeper walk with God, and because of that, they grew wider as other people were fascinated with the way that their lives were changing. But no one calls us the way anymore, and certainly no one ever calls us Jesusians or something like that. So followers, we're some of those. Then last week we said the obvious. We are a church. We are an ecclesia, which is the Bible way of saying we are called from the world's patterns of negativity, and at the same time we are apostles, apostoloi, sent out to heal the world. Called and sent, called and sent, called and sent, a dynamic faith. So this word, you don't get a cool Greek word from the Bible. Sorry, some of you have different opinions on that. This week, who are we? Very simply, we are Christians. Some of you, finally, that's the word that defines me. Some of you grew up Christians. You've always been to church. It's comfortable. It fits. It makes sense. You like it. You believe the stories. You try to live the teachings. You are Christians. It's a badge of honor. It's a warm, powerful word. It stands for something long and beautiful. You know other good Christians, and you wish other people would think about the world in that way. And does that sound familiar to anyone? Amen to anyone who's a Christian? Amen. Others of you are kind of squirming, like, oh boy, I picked the wrong Sunday to come here to this. Like, come on, Hansen, I'm not one of those. I like Jesus. This church is okay. I never thought I was going to be in a church, but it's okay. And I definitely like the idea of my life getting better on some kind of pattern with other people. But Christian? Don't you know the baggage that word holds? It's so old. So old-fashioned. It's so hurtful. It's like redcoats or Bolshevik or something like that we just don't use that word anymore. I was scribbling my sermon yesterday at our quarterly regional meeting of church leaders. Elders and pastors all get together 4 times a year. And at those things, you can't throw a Bible without hitting some grumpy old man who is still fighting cultural battles with a shield of faith and a sword of heresy. Not that the liberals were doing any better, because they end up just dragged into this dumb infighting and they fumble around with their newfound power. And so to the world, especially in the church, Christians look kind of dumb. And so I get it. For good reason, most people in our culture, especially those who have left the church, but a lot of people who are absolutely committed to everything that stands behind that word, they think that word, Christian, is kind of broken, kind of musty. So how do we unbreak it? How do we squirt some Febreze on Christianity? How can we redeem the word, and how can we live as little Christs? That's what it means. That's the IAN, little Christs. First of all, what happened to break it? Well, that word, these days, for many people, the image that it conjures up, it stands for judgmentalism. That's the number one connotation. When Pew Research did its study 6 years ago, they just asked around, when you hear the word Christian, what do you think? Judgment. What else do you think? Hypocrisy. That was the number 2 word. They said, what do you think when you hear Jesus? And they said, nice, which is a pathetic portrayal of a man who was put to death on a cross for challenging the status quo. But compare nice to the 3rd or 4th word. What is a Christian? Mean. For many people, the very last thing that Christian means in our country is like Christ. And this is for people on all sides and in all corners of the political spectrum. When Christians, as Christians, because of their Christian faith, stand up for the idea that some people are less valuable, when they ignore sexual abuse, when they turn a blind eye to racism, when Christians just don't care how much they hurt people, especially when they turn heaven upside down in order to hold on to a few rules that they've carved out in their self-centered interpretation of Scripture, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want anything to do with that. And if that title gets thrown on me and that's what they mean, it's a struggle for me. Because so often we're just all lumped into this one category defined by that completely un-Christ-like agenda. And if that's what Christian means, then in these sarcastic words of Mark Twain, Jesus is turning in his grave. You get the grave, he's not there anymore. This isn't just a modern phenomenon. This isn't just in your lifetime all of a sudden things have changed. Christians, like all people, because people get messy and that's what people do, Christians have a history of aggressive and meaningless violence and sexual oppression and economic abuse. Way back in 400 AD, long time ago, this guy named Saint Augustine. You hear the first part? Saint. His mom didn't give him that name. That was the church gave him that name. He's a big guy. He is on the Mount Rushmore of all Christian leaders for all time. Big guy. So if what he says is mad, if you're mad at that, email him, not me. But what St. Augustine said about the church, one of the strongest Christians ever, he said, the church is a whore, and it's my mother. Both sides. The church is a whore, and she is my mother. Christians are, in fact, a mess because we are people, and people have this tendency of being messy, especially when you give them power and money, especially when you take away their power. Christians have been ugly and opportunistic and dirty and immoral and rather clueless, and yet, there is still no stronger place, no greater place for compassion and acceptance and community and forgiveness and growth and encouragement, inspiration. There's nothing quite founded on generations of people refining and improving what they stand for. And those things, all those things I just named, they exist in other places. I promise you, they exist in other places. We have this flashy, fashionable aunt, Miss Politics. Oh, you can have a good teammate on Miss Politics, and you can have a little group and comfort together. We had this really loud and boisterous uncle, Mr. Sports. Oh, we can get inspired by Mr. Sports. We can be sad together with Mr. Sports. If you're a Cowboy fan, you're usually sad. You're pretty happy these days. Some of us, we just get so pushed in the direction, and we really rely on our overweight alcoholic spinster aunt, Miss Capitalism. That one really embraces us sometimes. And you can find all those things, encouragement, inspiration, acceptance, community, forgiveness. You can find that in all the groups you're in. You can find warm fuzzies on the internet all day long. You can piece together a fine group of values and life without Christianity, and many do. But a message of love and of hope at the level of, like, civilizational level, humankind level, that also meets us at heart level, close and personal. The tradition of faith is a reservoir of values that are bigger than us, deeper than any of our own perspectives, more lasting than any cultural project. For all of our ills, and all of us have ills, for all the reasons that Christian is such a soiled word, it is at the same time holy and sacred. I think that's what Augustine meant by that. And that can be the case whether you believe in God. Let's say you don't really believe in the God. Okay. Well, whatever you believe about Jesus, this, that, okay. Whatever your experience has been in church, whether you grew up in a really stuffy church that made all the kids sit down and none of them can draw on the pews, or whether you grew up in one of those loud, obnoxious churches, still, whatever it is, whatever your experience, the root of Christian faith is for many, and can be for you, life-changing and world-changing. And the root is Christ. And that root is not just a name. It's not a name. It is God's principle of holding the world together in love and directing it toward hope. The Christ is not simply a job title or just some weird guy 2,000 years ago. The Christ is a sacred perspective about all that exists in the world. It's something to hold on to, something to redeem for the world, something to hold up, something to share, something to preserve, something to celebrate. Whether you're Christian or not, Christ is something to celebrate. Because Christ is shorthand for this way of looking at the world where we ground ourselves with the very best of humankind's march toward goodness. Christ is this way of looking at the world where we ground ourselves with the very best, maybe better than any of us could ever be, at looking at a good world. And as a Christian, that's someone who says, Jesus did that. Jesus did that really special, and I want to follow that. That's a Christian versus a Christ. So what would it be like to follow in that way, in that regard? What would it be like to dust off our messy side of history and proclaim the true Christ of Christianity? What would it look like for all the people here to be little Christs? And what does it look like when this church is most Christian in that sense, grounded in the most holy perspective we can reach for? What could it look like if this church invested more into that identity? And what would it be like if we were, according to the Scripture, a light for this hill? What if we were that light on this hill? Let me tell you, the answer is not, this is surprising, sorry Dennis, but the answer is not doing more mission. It's not serving more. Although if we are Christ's light, we'll probably do those things. The answer is it's not about believing the right stuff or praying more or even coming to worship more. Although if we're Christ's light, those things are going to be affected. It's not about welcoming people. It's not about fellowship. It's not about certain moral behaviors, although that's going to come the more we push away from our sad past and toward our best values. But we are most like Christ and most Christian when we trust in the power and the process, the slow healing process of hope and love. I had 2 conversations this morning before the sermon where 2 people tipped me on to this aspect of the church, the slow process of turning away from frustration or anger and accepting that love and that hope. And you can understand Christ in a lot of ways. That word carries a ton of connotations. A lot of them are great. But that's how I understand it, as an eternal principle in the long tradition way before Jesus. People were looking for this thing, and they wanted to embody this thing. And some people thought this idea of a grounded grace and hope and love, some people thought that's got to come someday, in a person even. And others said, we are that. We're going to embody that in all of our gatherings. Paul said it this way, a little bit after Jesus. He said of this concept, 3 things remain: faith, hope, and love. Does that sound familiar? Or by the time you got married, did you just stop reading after all the other parts of that chapter? Sorry to burst some bubbles, but that chapter really has almost nothing to do with weddings. It certainly is an appropriate thing to say at weddings, but Paul's context in writing that is actually about church leaders, about how a church can get through the infighting and all the brokenness surrounding them. If you think Nederland is weird, it is. Corinth, where that book was written to, is Nederland with more like sexual problems, probably. Like more harems and God knows what. So Paul's writing that to these church leaders who think, what are we supposed to do in our weird town? And then they get in this little church and everyone's from a different place and has a different background. So they start fighting and they say, he can't be here, he can't be here. And Paul says, faith, hope, and love. Whatever else falls apart, trust that the values of hope and love will carry you through. And so today, many years later, as we face any turmoil in this body, we wonder, what do we do about money? What do we do when friendships are strained in the election? What do we do when we disagree about just the regular business of the church? What do we do about the little and the big frustrations between each other? When we're faced with the drama of our world, with fires and bombs and controversies and accusations and our own failures, and let's put at the top of the list any time that your spiritual leader has failed out there, all the nitpicky gossip that happens in this town, when that drags us down, we are most like Christ by maintaining our trust that loving each other is a better way. Even when that doesn't answer the question of what we're supposed to do, given any circumstances, that spiritual perspective is our faithful guidance. We are most Christian by maintaining our trust in a world that moves toward hope. Even if we don't have a clue what that means about getting through this despair or toward that renewal, we are a light on this hill when we make the littlest decisions day in and day out that add up. And those decisions that maintain a commitment to the small moments of faithful integrity. The small word spoken up in controversy. A small word of grace after controversy. Even if that doesn't, and it won't, affect the bottom line, that faithful perspective in no church has ever changed the budget like that. It just doesn't happen. But that spiritual perspective keeps this place doing its job of proclaiming Christ. That is perhaps our main mission as a church, is to proclaim Christ. And it is slow, dirty work. For whatever programs that succeed here, and we have some programs that are doing good, for however self-sustaining budget gets, and we're kind of on our way thanks to some great giving. For whatever big stances we take or we do in the world, perhaps the most important Christian thing we will ever accomplish is the long choice of humility. So that in this town there's going to be some guy out there who would never walk through these doors. You know this guy. You know this woman who will never walk through this door. They don't believe in the God that they learned in Sunday school. They've been burned by Christians. All they've ever read on the internet or seen on news is just gross Christians. But slowly, they think, yeah, but that church is doing something, and my friends kind of go there, and they say good things about it. I'm never going to go there, but it makes me wonder about God. It makes me wonder what I missed. If we can do that in this town, then we have accomplished so much. So friends, we do not need to be defined by cultural assumptions around Christian-ish quasi-politics or the most vocal Christian propaganda machine. We do not need to be defined at all by any particular interpretation. We do not need to be defined by easily definable actions. But what if we allowed ourselves to be grown and to be nurtured by the holiness at the root of all life, the holiness that gets shared and expressed every time we gather to reread the gospel? And by the way, for those of you, for me, who hate the idea of organized religion, I know it's ironic. For everyone who hates the idea of organized religion, the word religion has two totally separate etymologies. One of them is it's rejoining, like ligament, where we get the word ligament, religamenting ourselves together. And the other one is relectio, rereading the stories that found our most basic holy values. So every time we gather here, that is a beautiful sense of totally disorganized religion. And what if we embraced that light to change our lives and shined it back on the world and invited others to wonder and ponder with us? I don't know what the world would do with that. I don't know what that means about our actual decisions and actions, but I do know that it would be a Christianity that I would be proud to pick up and dust off and hold up. Amen.